Cannabis, 10,000 years of partnership, 1 century of war, a molecule caught between healing and persecution. Before writing, before agriculture, before civilization itself, humans and this plant walked together. From sacred Scythian smoke to the rigging on ships that discovered new worlds, it built empires, healed the sick, and opened minds. Then everything changed. In a single generation, racist propaganda transformed an ancient crop into public enemy number 1. Millions incarcerated, communities shattered, a plant war that would rage for nearly a century. While the molecule sat unchanged, waiting in trichomes and courtrooms, in hidden grows and research labs. Now watch as prohibition crumbles, as science rediscovers what shamans always knew, as the endocannabinoid system reveals secrets written into every human brain. This is the epic tale of a molecule that survived colonization, demonization, and commodification, and emerged to challenge everything we thought we knew about consciousness, justice, and what it means to be free. The journey from soil to soul, from felony to pharmacy, from ancient wisdom to uncertain future. This is the complete science of cannabis. Before we begin, if you enjoy these types of interesting science topics, hit the like button, comment, and tell us where you are listening from. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, you know what to do. Simply subscribe. The plant emerged from Central Asian steppes millions of years before humans walked upright, its serrated leaves catching wind across grasslands that stretched beyond horizons. Cannabis sativa, a flowering plant in the family that includes hops and hackberries, evolved to produce a sticky resin coating, its reproductive structures, a chemical defense against herbivores and environmental stress. Within that resin, dozens of compounds formed, including one that would eventually alter human consciousness across every inhabited continent. The relationship between humans and cannabis extends so far into prehistory that separating the two stories becomes impossible. Archaeological evidence places cannabis use at least 10,000 years ago, possibly earlier. Charred seeds appear in pottery from ancient China. Textile impressions in clay show fibers woven before the invention of writing. Tombs in the Caucasus Mountains contain traces of burned cannabis, suggesting ceremonial use by people who left no written records of their beliefs or practices. In the Yangshao culture of Neolithic China, cannabis provided fiber for rope, fabric for clothing, seeds for food, and medicine for ailments. Ancient texts describe its properties, recommending it for pain, inflammation, and various disorders. The plant was called ma, a word that persists in modern Chinese. Cultivation techniques refined over millennia turned cannabis into one of humanity's oldest agricultural relationships. From Central Asia, the plant spread along trade routes. Nomadic peoples carried seeds westward into Europe, southward into India, eastward across the Pacific. Each culture that encountered cannabis found uses matching their needs. In India, it became bhang, a drink consumed during festivals and religious observances. In the Middle East, hashish concentrated resin appeared in historical records more than 1,000 years ago. In Africa, diverse societies cultivated varieties for fiber, food, and ritual. The plant's biology facilitated this spread. Cannabis grows readily in temperate and tropical climates, tolerates poor soil, requires minimal water compared to many crops, and matures quickly. Its seeds remain viable for years. A single plant produces thousands of seeds. These characteristics made cannabis an ideal companion for human migration, adapting to new environments as readily as the people who carried it. But why does cannabis produce the compounds that affect human consciousness? The answer lies not in any relationship with humans, but in evolutionary pressures predating our species. The resin that coats cannabis flowers contains cannabinoids, terpenoids, and flavonoids, chemicals that deter insects, protect against ultraviolet radiation, and prevent fungal infections. Female plants, which produce the flowers and seeds ensuring reproductive success, generate the highest concentrations of these protective compounds. The most abundant cannabinoid, tetrahydrocannabinol, serves the plant's survival, not human pleasure. Its psychoactive properties are incidental, a consequence of molecular structure that happens to interact with mammalian neurology. Yet this accident of biochemistry would profoundly shape human history, culture, law, and medicine. Ancient uses were practical and sacred. Hemp fiber, derived from cannabis stalks, was stronger and more durable than most plant fibers. It made rope that wouldn't rot in salt water, canvas for sails, paper that lasted centuries. The word canvas itself derives from cannabis. European ships exploring the world sailed on cannabis rigging. The first drafts of foundational documents were written on cannabis paper. Simultaneously, the plant held spiritual significance. Scythian nomads, according to the Greek historian writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, burned cannabis seeds in enclosed spaces and inhaled the smoke during funeral rites. In Hindu traditions, cannabis became associated with the god Shiva, consumed during the festival of Mahashivaratri. Sufi mystics incorporated hashish into contemplative practices, seeking altered states conducive to spiritual insight. This dual nature, utilitarian and consciousness-altering, mundane and sacred, would characterize cannabis throughout its journey with humanity. The same plant provided rope for sailing ships and visions for mystics, fabric for clothing and medicine for pain. Its versatility made it valuable. Its psychoactivity made it controversial. By the time European colonizers reached the Americas, cannabis had already circled the globe. Spanish conquistadors brought hemp to the New World for fiber production. British colonists grew it in Jamestown. George Washington cultivated hemp at Mount Vernon. The plant, now fully domesticated and dependent on human cultivation in many regions, had become inseparable from human agriculture and industry. Yet the story was about to change dramatically. The 20th century would bring prohibition, criminalization, and a war on the plant that continues in many regions today. But that transformation begins not with the plant itself, but with how humans harvest, process, and transform it into substances that alter consciousness. The journey from seed to harvest follows rhythms as old as agriculture itself. Cannabis begins as a seed, small and mottled, containing the genetic blueprint for a plant that can grow 20 feet tall or remain compact and bushy, depending on genetics and environment. Planted in spring after the last frost, the seed germinates within days if conditions align: proper moisture, temperature, and darkness. A taproot pushes downward, seeking stability and water. Cotyledons, the first leaves, push upward, breaking through soil to catch light. Photosynthesis begins. The plant enters vegetative growth, developing the distinctive serrated leaves that have become culturally iconic. During this phase, which can last weeks or months depending on variety and light cycle, the plant focuses on growth, building structure, and storing energy. Cannabis is dioecious, meaning individual plants are typically male or female, though hermaphroditic plants occasionally occur. Males produce pollen. Females produce flowers, the parts humans seek for their cannabinoid content. In natural settings, wind carries pollen from male to female plants. Fertilized females develop seeds, ensuring the next generation. But for human purposes, preventing fertilization is crucial. Unfertilized female flowers, called sinsemilla, pour resources into resin production rather than seed development. The sticky coating becomes thick, covering flowers in a glittering layer of trichomes, microscopic structures resembling tiny mushrooms under magnification. Within these trichomes, cannabinoid synthesis occurs, producing the compounds humans desire. Light triggers flowering. Cannabis is photoperiod sensitive, beginning flower production when nights lengthen beyond a critical threshold. Outdoor plants naturally flower in late summer and autumn. Indoor cultivators manipulate light cycles, controlling when plants transition from vegetative growth to flowering, allowing multiple harvests per year. Environmental conditions profoundly affect cannabinoid production. Stress can increase resin as the plant attempts to protect itself. Temperature extremes, nutrient deficiencies, and controlled drought in final weeks before harvest may enhance potency, though these techniques require knowledge and careful management. Too much stress damages the plant. Too little yields weaker flowers. Traditional cultivation occurred outdoors, in fields or hidden forest clearings, dependent on seasons and weather. Plants grew large, harvested once annually. Farmers selected seeds from the most vigorous or potent plants, slowly developing varieties adapted to local conditions. This process, repeated over generations, created landrace strains genetically distinct varieties from specific regions, like the mountains of Afghanistan or the hills of Jamaica. Modern cultivation transformed this ancient practice. Indoor growing, enabled by electric lights and climate control, removed seasonal constraints. Hydroponic systems replaced soil. Breeding became systematic, crossing strains to enhance desired traits: potency, yield, flavor, appearance, growth speed. The plant that once grew seasonally outdoors now thrives year-round in warehouses and basements, optimized for maximum cannabinoid production. Hemp cultivation, focused on fiber and seeds rather than drug content, follows different protocols. Hemp varieties contain minimal tetrahydrocannabinol, bred specifically to comply with legal thresholds. These plants grow tall and thin, crowded together to encourage vertical growth and long fibers. They're harvested before flowering completes, when stalks reach peak fiber quality. The distinction between hemp and drug varieties is genetic but also cultural and legal. The same species, Cannabis sativa, encompasses both. The difference lies in selective breeding and cultivation methods. For millennia, farmers grew cannabis for different purposes, inadvertently selecting for high-fiber, low cannabinoid varieties or high cannabinoid, lower fiber varieties. Modern breeding has accentuated these differences. Harvest timing requires judgment. Too early, and cannabinoid production remains incomplete. Too late, and degradation begins, with tetrahydrocannabinol converting to less psychoactive compounds. Cultivators examine trichomes under magnification, looking for the moment when clear resin turns milky white with amber accents, the signal of peak potency. The harvest itself is labor-intensive. Plants are cut at the base, hung upside down in dark, climate-controlled spaces, and dried slowly over 1 to 2 weeks. Proper drying is crucial. Too fast, and the outer plant material dries while inner stems retain moisture, encouraging mold. Too slow, and fungal contamination ruins the crop. Temperature and humidity must be carefully managed. After drying comes curing, a process where flowers are stored in sealed containers, opened periodically to release moisture and allow controlled degradation of chlorophyll and other compounds. Curing enhances flavor, smooths harshness, and can affect cannabinoid profiles. Properly cured cannabis can be stored for extended periods without significant potency loss if kept cool, dark, and dry. This transformation from living plant to dried flower ready for consumption represents the first stage of preparation, but dried flowers are just the beginning. The next transformation from plant material to concentrated compounds, from raw harvest to refined products, follows pathways both ancient and modern. The dried flower, examined closely, reveals a landscape of trichomes covering every surface. These tiny structures contain cannabinoids in their most concentrated form, synthesized by the plant and stored within glandular heads. When humans consume cannabis, they are consuming this resin, along with plant material leaves, stems, cellular structures that contain little of the desired compounds. The primary psychoactive cannabinoid, tetrahydrocannabinol, exists in the plant predominantly as tetrahydrocannabinolic acid. The acid form is not significantly psychoactive. Transformation to the active form requires decarboxylation, removal of a carboxyl group from the molecular structure. This occurs through heat or, very slowly, through time and light exposure. When cannabis is smoked, combustion instantly decarboxylates the cannabinoids. The heat of a flame, typically exceeding 1,000 degrees, breaks the molecular bonds, converting acid forms to active forms in milliseconds. The smoke carries these molecules into the lungs, where they pass through lung tissue into the bloodstream, reaching the brain within seconds. Vaporization applies lower temperatures, typically between 300 and 400 degrees, sufficient to decarboxylate and vaporize cannabinoids without combusting plant material. This produces vapor rather than smoke, avoiding many toxic byproducts of combustion while still delivering cannabinoids rapidly to the bloodstream. When cannabis is consumed orally, decarboxylation must occur beforehand. Raw cannabis is not significantly psychoactive because the acid forms of cannabinoids are poorly absorbed and minimally active. Heating cannabis, baking it in an oven at low temperature, for example, converts the acids to active forms, making the material suitable for consumption in food. Edibles, as orally consumed cannabis products are called, behave very differently from smoked or vaporized cannabis. Digestion is slow. Cannabinoids pass through the stomach into the small intestine, are absorbed into the bloodstream, and travel to the liver before reaching the brain. The liver metabolizes tetrahydrocannabinol into a different compound, often producing stronger and longer-lasting effects. Onset can take 30 minutes to 2 hours. Duration extends to 6 hours or more. This transformation from smoked to eaten, from rapid to delayed onset, changes not just pharmacology, but culture and risk. Edibles allow consumption without smoking, appealing to those concerned about respiratory health. But the delayed onset leads to a common problem. Users consume more before feeling effects, then become overwhelmed when everything hits simultaneously. Beyond simple consumption, humans have developed methods to concentrate cannabinoids, removing plant material and isolating desired compounds. Traditional methods, practiced for centuries, include hand-rolling fresh flowers to collect resin, or sieving dried flowers to separate trichomes from plant material. The resulting products hashish, kief contain higher cannabinoid concentrations than whole flowers. Modern extraction uses solvents. At a conceptual level, cannabinoids dissolve in certain liquids, alcohols, hydrocarbons, or supercritical carbon dioxide. Plant material is soaked or washed in solvent. Cannabinoids dissolve. The liquid is separated from plant matter, and then solvent is evaporated, leaving concentrated cannabinoids behind. The specifics of this process, including solvents, temperatures, pressures, and equipment, cross into actionable territory and will not be detailed here. What matters is understanding that these processes produce concentrates far more potent than flowers. Where dried flower might contain 15 to 25% tetrahydrocannabinol by weight, concentrates can exceed 70, 80, even 90%. These products, often called wax, shatter, oil, or dabs, depending on consistency and production method, represent a dramatic shift in cannabis consumption. Concentration technology has exploded in legal markets. Vaporizer cartridges filled with cannabis oil provide discreet, odorless consumption. Tinctures allow precise dosing. Topical creams deliver cannabinoids through skin for localized effects without psychoactivity. The plant that humans once simply dried and smoked has been transformed into a spectrum of products, each with distinct characteristics and uses. Another significant cannabinoid, cannabidiol, has gained attention for therapeutic properties without producing intoxication. Unlike tetrahydrocannabinol, cannabidiol does not bind strongly to the primary receptors responsible for psychoactive effects. It modulates other receptors and systems, producing effects described as relaxing without being impairing. Extraction and isolation of cannabidiol have created markets for products that provide potential medical benefits without the high many users want to avoid. The environmental impact of modern cannabis cultivation varies dramatically. Outdoor cultivation, while requiring land and water, generally has lower environmental footprint than many crops. Indoor cultivation, however, consumes enormous energy. High-intensity lights, climate control systems, and ventilation run continuously, making indoor cannabis among the most energy-intensive crops per pound produced. In regions where electricity comes from fossil fuels, the carbon footprint is substantial. Water use also varies. Cannabis requires moderate water compared to some crops, but more than others. In regions experiencing drought, large-scale outdoor cultivation can strain water resources. Nutrient runoff from intensive cultivation can pollute waterways. Pesticide use, particularly in illicit cultivation lacking regulatory oversight, introduces environmental and consumer health risks. Legal markets have begun addressing these issues, with regulations requiring testing for contaminants, standards for pesticide use, and in some places, sustainability requirements. But illicit cultivation, still dominant globally, operates without such constraints. Precursor chemicals for synthetic cannabinoids, artificial compounds designed to mimic cannabis effects, exist in pharmaceutical and research contexts. These synthetic cannabinoids, sometimes sold as alternatives to natural cannabis, have caused significant harm due to unpredictable potency and effects. They represent a different category entirely from plant-derived cannabis and highlight the risks of chemical substitutes for natural compounds. The journey from plant to product, from field to consumer, involves transformations both simple and complex, whether dried flower or concentrated oil, whether grown under sun or artificial light. The end result is a substance containing molecules that interact with human biology in specific and profound ways. The next chapter of this journey is geographic and economic, tracing how cannabis moves through human societies and markets. Cannabis traveled the world twice. First, across centuries and millennia, carried by traders, migrants, and colonizers, spreading through agricultural and cultural exchange. Second, across decades, through smuggling networks and black markets, moving in secret under prohibition's shadow. These two journeys, separated by the transformation of cannabis from accepted crop to forbidden substance, tell parallel stories of human desire, cultural exchange, and political control. The first journey is ancient. Hemp and drug varieties of cannabis moved along the Silk Road, that network of trade routes connecting Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. Merchants carried seeds, techniques, and knowledge. Cannabis reached Africa, where diverse societies cultivated varieties adapted to local conditions. Arabic traders brought hashish culture across North Africa and into Spain. The plant became integral to societies far from its Central Asian origins. European colonial expansion carried hemp to the Americas. Spanish grew it in Chile by the mid-16th century. British colonists planted it in Virginia, Massachusetts, and throughout colonies where fiber crops were economically important. For centuries, cannabis was simply another useful plant, unremarkable, except for its versatility. The second journey begins in the early 20th century, when attitudes shifted and cannabis transformed from crop to contraband. This transformation has roots in racism, politics, and social anxiety, more than pharmacology or public health. In the United States, cannabis smoking was associated with Mexican immigrants and African American jazz musicians. During a period of intense racial anxiety and xenophobia, substances associated with minority communities became targets for legal control. Politicians and law enforcement officials made explicitly racist arguments connecting cannabis to violence and moral degradation, claims unsupported by evidence but effective as propaganda. By the 1930s, many American states had banned cannabis. Federal prohibition followed. The campaign against cannabis included deliberate misinformation, exaggerated claims of dangers, fabricated statistics, and stigmatizing rhetoric that conflated cannabis with far more dangerous substances. The plant became known by the Spanish-derived term marijuana, emphasizing foreign associations to fuel anti-immigrant sentiment. This prohibition spread internationally. The United Nations Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, adopted in the early 1960s, classified cannabis as a dangerous substance alongside opioids, requiring signatory nations to prohibit cultivation and trade. Countries worldwide, pressured by the United States and international bodies, criminalized a plant that had been cultivated for millennia. But prohibition did not eliminate demand. Instead, it created black markets. Cannabis cultivation shifted from legal farms to hidden locations. Remote forests, private basements, fortified compounds in regions with weak governance. Trade networks emerged to move product from cultivation areas to consumer markets. In the late 20th century, major smuggling routes developed. Moroccan hashish moved through Spain into Europe. Lebanese and Afghan hashish traveled similar routes. Mexican cannabis crossed the border into the United States by the ton, transported in vehicles, carried by mules, smuggled through tunnels. Colombian and then Mexican cartels added cannabis to portfolios that included cocaine and heroin, though cannabis generated less profit per pound than those substances. The risks were different too. Cannabis, being a plant that could be grown almost anywhere, never developed the concentrated source region dynamics of coca or opium poppies. Mexican cartels could control supply into the United States from the south, but domestic cultivation within the United States provided competition. Aggressive law enforcement targeted both trafficking and domestic cultivation, leading to thousands of arrests annually, disproportionately affecting communities of color despite similar usage rates across racial groups. The domestic cultivation industry in the United States evolved sophisticated techniques. Indoor growing allowed year-round production and higher potency through environmental control. Regions like Northern California developed cultures around cultivation, with entire local economies dependent on the crop despite its illegality. Law enforcement responses escalated. Helicopter flyovers searching for outdoor plots, raids on warehouses and homes, asset seizures, mandatory minimum sentences that imprisoned growers for decades. Globally, prohibition created uneven enforcement. In some regions, cannabis remained quasi-tolerated, with laws on books but enforcement minimal. In others, possession could result in death penalty or decades of imprisonment. The Netherlands famously adopted a policy of tolerated retail sales through coffee shops. Despite ongoing prohibition at the national level, this created cannabis tourism, with visitors traveling specifically to consume legally purchased cannabis. Trade remained largely regional, unlike cocaine or heroin, which required long-distance smuggling from specific source regions. Cannabis could be produced locally or regionally, reducing the need for complex international trafficking. Where international trade occurred, it typically involved hashish concentrates rather than bulky flowers, since concentrated products offered better value-to-weight ratios for smuggling. Then, beginning in the late 20th century and accelerating in the 21st, the third journey began: re-legalization. Uruguay became the first nation to fully legalize recreational cannabis in the early 21st century. Canada followed. In the United States, states began legalizing despite ongoing federal prohibition, starting with Colorado and Washington, eventually expanding to nearly half the states. This shift from illegal to legal markets represents a profound transformation. Cultivation moved from hidden grows to licensed facilities. Quality control and testing became standard. Taxation generated revenue. Employment in cannabis industries became legitimate. Retail stores, operating like any business, sold cannabis to adults. But legalization created new tensions. Corporations entered the market, seeking profits from an industry built by people who had risked imprisonment for decades. Medical cannabis patients, who had established access through quasi-legal systems, watched recreational legalization raise prices and shift market dynamics. Indigenous communities and communities of color, disproportionately harmed by prohibition, saw predominantly white entrepreneurs profit from legalization while those with prior convictions remained barred from industry participation. International prohibition remains through UN conventions, even as individual nations and subnational jurisdictions legalize. This creates conflicts between local and international law, complicating trade and banking. Legal cannabis businesses often cannot access traditional banking because banks fear federal enforcement. International travel with legal cannabis remains prohibited in most contexts. The economic transformation has been dramatic. Legal cannabis markets generate billions in annual revenue. Investment capital flows into cultivation facilities, retail operations, and product development. The plant, once cultivated by individuals risking imprisonment, is now grown by corporations with shareholders and quarterly earnings reports. Medical legalization preceded recreational legalization in many places, creating frameworks where patients could access cannabis with physician recommendations. This medical pathway provided political cover for broader legalization, normalizing cannabis use and demonstrating that legal access need not cause social catastrophe. The routes now are not smuggling trails but supply chains, from licensed cultivators to testing laboratories to distributors to retailers. The journey from prohibition to regulation continues unevenly across the world, with some regions embracing legalization while others maintain harsh penalties. The plant that traveled the world as a crop, then as contraband, now travels as both simultaneously, depending on jurisdiction. This transformation from underground to mainstream, from criminal to commercial, sets the stage for understanding how cannabis arrives in the hands of contemporary consumers. In the hands of a consumer in a legal market, cannabis arrives in packaging, labeled with cannabinoid content, tested for contaminants, and sold by employees who can describe effects and recommend products. In the hands of a consumer in a prohibited market, cannabis arrives as it has for decades, in plastic bags of uncertain origin and purity, exchanged in parking lots or private homes, untested and unregulated. The contrast illustrates how dramatically context shapes the cannabis experience. Legal markets offer variety unimaginable under prohibition. Retail shelves display dozens of strains, varieties bred for specific cannabinoid profiles, flavors, and effects. Indica-dominant varieties are marketed as relaxing, suitable for evening use. Sativa-dominant varieties are marketed as energizing, appropriate for daytime. Hybrid varieties combine characteristics. This classification system, while culturally entrenched, has limited scientific validity. Chemical analysis often shows more variation within categories than between them. Effects depend more on specific cannabinoid and terpene profiles than on indica versus sativa classification. But the language persists because consumers and retailers find it useful, even if oversimplified. Flowers remain the most common form, sold in glass jars or sealed bags, weighing from 1 gram to 1 ounce or more. Appearance varies. Some flowers are dense and compact, others loose and fluffy. Colors range from deep green to purple, orange pistils threading through, everything coated in crystalline trichomes. Smell ranges from citrus to fuel to earth to fruit, depending on terpene content. Pre-rolled products, Cannabis ground and rolled into paper cones offer convenience. Concentrates come in forms bewildering to those unfamiliar. Shatters resembling amber glass, waxes with consistency like honeycomb, oils golden and viscous, live resins capturing flavor profiles of fresh plants. Vaporizer cartridges contain concentrated oil, threaded onto battery-powered devices that heat liquid to vapor temperature. Edibles encompass everything from brownies to gummies to beverages to mints. Dosing is critical. A standard recreational dose is often considered 5 to 10 milligrams of tetrahydrocannabinol, though tolerance varies enormously. Edible packaging in legal markets displays cannabinoid content and serving sizes. Each gummy or cookie segment is measured, allowing controlled consumption. Topical products, lotions, balms, patches deliver cannabinoids through skin, primarily for localized pain or inflammation relief. These generally do not produce psychoactive effects because cannabinoids do not reach the bloodstream in significant quantities when applied topically. Potency has increased dramatically compared to cannabis available in previous decades, where flowers once contained 5 to 10% tetrahydrocannabinol. Modern genetics and cultivation techniques produce flowers with 25 to 30% routinely. Concentrates exceed these levels dramatically. This increased potency means users can achieve desired effects with smaller amounts, but also increases risks of overconsumption, particularly for inexperienced users. Illicit markets, still dominant in most of the world, offer less variety and no testing. Cannabis arrives as flowers of unknown genetics and potency, sometimes compressed into bricks from large-scale cultivation operations, sometimes carefully grown by small-scale cultivators. Quality ranges from excellent to poor. Contaminants, mold, pesticides, mislabeled products pose risks without regulatory oversight. Adulteration concerns differ from other illicit drugs. Cannabis flowers are difficult to adulterate in ways that add weight or mimic effects, unlike powders that can be cut with inert substances. The primary concerns are contamination rather than intentional adulteration. Mold from poor storage, pesticides from cultivation, or less commonly, synthetic cannabinoids sprayed onto low-quality flower to increase apparent potency. Cultural contexts around cannabis use span enormous range. Medical patients consume cannabis for conditions from chronic pain to epilepsy to cancer treatment side effects. Recreational users consume socially, like alcohol, or alone for relaxation. Some consume daily, integrating cannabis into routines as unremarkable as morning coffee. Others consume rarely, treating cannabis as an occasional indulgence. The demographics of use challenge stereotypes. Cannabis users span all ages, races, socioeconomic statuses, and professions. The stoner stereotype, unmotivated, unproductive, culturally marginal, persists in media but reflects neither statistical reality nor the diversity of users. Professionals, parents, athletes, artists, executives, and retirees all number among regular cannabis users. Socioeconomic disparities remain despite legalization. In some legal markets, retail prices put cannabis beyond reach of low-income consumers who may continue accessing illicit markets. Expungement of prior cannabis convictions. While progress often requires legal processes many cannot navigate, employment discrimination persists, with many employers maintaining zero-tolerance policies despite legality. Ceremonial and spiritual use continues in communities where cannabis holds religious significance. Rastafarian traditions view cannabis as sacrament. Some practitioners of various spiritual paths incorporate cannabis into meditation, yoga, or other practices, viewing it as a tool for insight or connection. The youth perspective matters crucially. Despite legalization being adult-only, adolescent access remains a concern. Research suggests legalization has not dramatically increased youth use. but concerns persist about developing brains and cannabis exposure. Prevention efforts focus on delaying first use and educating about risks. Cannabis in consumer hands is thus many things simultaneously: medicine, recreational substance, spiritual tool, agricultural product, commodity, cultural symbol. Its meaning is not inherent in the plant or molecule, but constructed through context, culture, regulation, and individual intention. As cannabis is consumed, smoked, vaporized, eaten, or otherwise delivered, the next chapter unfolds within the human body, where molecules meet biology and effects emerge. The cannabinoid molecules, now entering the body, encounter a system that seems designed specifically to receive them. This is not coincidence, but evolutionary convergence. The endocannabinoid system exists in all vertebrate animals, regulating numerous physiological processes. It evolved long before cannabis appeared, and the plant's cannabinoids interact with this system because of structural similarities to compounds the body produces naturally. The endocannabinoid system consists of receptors distributed throughout the brain and body, endogenous cannabinoids that bind to these receptors, and enzymes that synthesize and break down these compounds. The system regulates appetite, pain, sensation, mood, memory, immune function, and more. It maintains homeostasis, adjusting physiological processes to keep the body in balance. Two primary receptor types exist. CB1 receptors concentrate in the brain and central nervous system, particularly in areas governing movement, memory, cognition, and perception. CB2 receptors concentrate in peripheral tissues, especially immune system cells. Tetrahydrocannabinol binds to both, though with higher affinity for CB1, explaining its psychoactive effects. Cannabidiol has low affinity for these receptors but modulates other receptors and influences how the body metabolizes its own endocannabinoids. When cannabis smoke or vapor enters lungs, absorption occurs almost instantly. The lungs provide enormous surface area through tiny air sacs called alveoli. Cannabinoids pass through thin membranes into capillaries, enter the bloodstream, and within seconds reach the brain. Effects begin within minutes, peak within 30 minutes, and diminish over 2 to 3 hours. The subjective effects are distinctive. Perception shifts. Colors may seem more vibrant. Music becomes more immersive. Time distorts, with minutes feeling longer. Sequences of thought meandering rather than progressing linearly. Appetite increases, a phenomenon so reliable it has medical applications for wasting diseases. Short-term memory becomes unreliable conversations, drift, thoughts interrupt themselves. The beginning of a sentence is forgotten before reaching the end. Mood changes vary enormously between individuals and contexts. Many users report relaxation, euphoria, increased appreciation for sensory experiences. Others experience anxiety, paranoia, or discomfort, particularly at higher doses or in stressful settings. The same person may have different experiences at different times, illustrating how much factors beyond the molecule shape the experience. Motor coordination is impaired. Fine movements become difficult. Reaction times slow. This impairment makes activities requiring coordination and quick responses, especially driving, dangerous. Unlike alcohol, where intoxication correlates relatively reliably with blood concentration, cannabis impairment is harder to measure objectively, complicating legal and safety considerations. Physiologically, the cardiovascular system responds. Heart rate increases, sometimes significantly, especially in inexperienced users. Blood pressure changes, typically dropping when standing, causing occasional dizziness. Blood vessels in the eyes dilate, causing the characteristic redness associated with cannabis use. For healthy individuals, these effects are generally benign. For those with cardiovascular disease, increased heart rate could pose risks. The respiratory system experiences effects from smoking or vaporizing. Smoke contains irritants that inflame airways. Chronic cannabis smoking is associated with respiratory symptoms, cough, bronchitis, increased mucus, though the relationship between cannabis smoking and lung cancer remains unclear, with studies showing conflicting results. Vaporizing reduces but does not eliminate respiratory irritation. When cannabis is consumed orally, the timeline and character of effects change dramatically. Digestion delays onset. Cannabinoids must pass through the stomach and be absorbed in the intestines. They then travel to the liver via the hepatic portal system. The liver metabolizes tetrahydrocannabinol into 11-hydroxy-THC, a compound that crosses the blood-brain barrier more readily and produces stronger effects than tetrahydrocannabinol itself. This metabolism explains why edibles feel different than smoked cannabis. The effects are more intense, more sedating, longer lasting. Onset can take 30 minutes to 2 hours depending on stomach contents and individual metabolism. Peak effects occur around 3 to 4 hours after consumption. Duration extends to 6 to 8 hours or more. The delayed onset leads to a common mistake: consuming more before feeling effects, then experiencing overwhelming intoxication when everything metabolizes simultaneously. The subjective experience at high doses can be profoundly disorienting. Paranoia, anxiety, and feelings of being out of control are common with excessive consumption. These experiences, while unpleasant and sometimes frightening, are not medically dangerous in the acute sense. Unlike opioid or alcohol overdose, cannabis overdose does not cause respiratory depression or organ failure. Fatalities directly attributable to cannabis toxicity are essentially non-existent. However, impaired judgment and coordination can lead to accidents. Cannabis intoxication contributes to vehicle crashes, though less dramatically than alcohol. Mixing cannabis with alcohol or other substances amplifies impairment beyond either substance alone. Individual variation in response to cannabis is substantial. Genetics influence how quickly cannabinoids are metabolized, how densely receptors are expressed, and how sensitively the endocannabinoid system responds. Experience matters too. Tolerance develops with regular use, requiring larger doses to achieve the same effects. This tolerance, unlike with some substances, does not persist indefinitely. Abstaining for days or weeks allows tolerance to reset. The effects are dose-dependent, but not linearly. A small amount might produce relaxation and mild euphoria. A moderate amount might add perceptual changes and stronger mood effects. A large amount might produce anxiety, disorientation, and discomfort. The relationship between dose and effects is not a straight line, but a curve where more is not always better. The experience also depends on the balance of cannabinoids present. Tetrahydrocannabinol alone produces different effects than tetrahydrocannabinol combined with cannabidiol. Some users report that cannabidiol moderates the anxiety and intensity of tetrahydrocannabinol, creating a smoother experience. Research supports this, showing cannabidiol can antagonize some effects of tetrahydrocannabinol. Terpenes, the aromatic compounds giving cannabis its diverse smells, may also influence effects, though research is preliminary. Some terpenes are sedating, others stimulating. The combination of cannabinoids and terpenes, the so-called entourage effect, may produce experiences distinct from isolated compounds. This would explain why whole plant cannabis feels different than pure tetrahydrocannabinol, though more research is needed to confirm these mechanisms. As the acute effects subside, typically over a few hours for smoked cannabis or longer for edibles, most physiological measures return to baseline. The subjective experience fades. Users describe feeling tired, sometimes hungry, often ready to sleep. The next day, residual effects are typically minimal, though heavy use or high doses might leave some grogginess or difficulty concentrating. This immediate journey from consumption to intoxication to return to baseline is the acute phase. But what happens with repeated use over months or years? The next chapter explores long-term impacts on health and behavior. When cannabis use extends from occasional to regular to daily, the relationship between person and plant transforms. Acute effects give way to longer-term patterns involving tolerance, dependence, and diverse health impacts, both positive and negative. The toxicological profile of cannabis, like psilocybin, shows remarkable safety in terms of lethal dose. The amount of tetrahydrocannabinol required to kill a human is absurdly high, thousands of times a typical dose. Acute cannabis toxicity, while unpleasant, does not cause death through organ failure or respiratory depression. In this specific sense, cannabis is safer than alcohol, opioids, or many legal pharmaceuticals. However, this does not mean cannabis is without risks. Psychological and behavioral consequences can be significant, particularly with heavy long-term use. Addiction. While less likely than with alcohol, opioids, or stimulants, does occur. Research estimates roughly 9% of people who try cannabis will develop dependence, with higher rates among those who start young or use daily. Cannabis use disorder, the clinical term, involves continuing use despite negative consequences, unsuccessful attempts to quit, and withdrawal symptoms when stopping. Withdrawal from heavy regular use is real but relatively mild compared to alcohol or opioid withdrawal. Symptoms include irritability, anxiety, sleep disturbance, decreased appetite, and cravings. These peak within the first week of abstinence and diminish over several weeks. Unlike alcohol or benzodiazepine withdrawal, cannabis withdrawal is not medically dangerous, though it is uncomfortable and contributes to relapse. The mechanism of dependence involves the endocannabinoid system adapting to constant cannabinoid exposure. Receptors downregulate, their density decreases, and they become less sensitive. The system recalibrates around external cannabinoid supply. When that supply stops, the system is temporarily depleted until natural endocannabinoid function recovers. Cognitive effects with chronic heavy use have been documented. Memory, attention, and executive function may decline during periods of heavy use. Most research suggests these impairments largely reverse with abstinence, though some studies indicate residual effects, particularly if heavy use began in adolescence. The adolescent brain, still developing, appears more vulnerable to cannabis-related cognitive impacts than the adult brain. The relationship between cannabis and mental health is complex and controversial. Cannabis use is associated with increased risk of psychotic disorders, including schizophrenia. This association is strongest for heavy use beginning in adolescence and for individuals with genetic vulnerability. Whether cannabis causes psychosis or individuals predisposed to psychosis are more likely to use cannabis remains debated. The most likely explanation is bidirectional. Cannabis may precipitate psychosis in vulnerable individuals who might not have developed symptoms otherwise, while some people prone to psychosis may self-medicate with cannabis. Anxiety and depression show similarly complex relationships. Some users report cannabis helps manage these conditions. Others find cannabis worsens anxiety or contributes to a motivation and depression. The relationship likely depends on dose, frequency, individual biology, and baseline mental health. Cannabidiol specifically has shown promise in anxiety research, though more studies are needed. Respiratory effects from smoking have been mentioned but warrant deeper attention. Chronic cannabis smoking produces respiratory symptoms similar to tobacco smoking: cough, bronchitis, increased mucus. However, the relationship between cannabis smoking and lung cancer remains unclear. Some studies find increased risk. Others find no association. Still, others suggest possible protective effects from cannabinoids. The truth likely lies in complexity. cannabis smoke contains carcinogens, but patterns of use differ from tobacco, and cannabinoids may have anti-inflammatory or anti-cancer properties that moderate risks. Cardiovascular concerns have emerged, particularly in older adults. Cannabis increases heart rate and blood pressure variability, potentially triggering cardiac events in individuals with existing heart disease. For healthy individuals, risks appear minimal, but for those with cardiovascular conditions, consultation with physicians is advisable. Pregnancy and cannabis use raise concerns. Tetrahydrocannabinol crosses the placental barrier. Research on effects is mixed and complicated by confounding factors. Cannabis users may also use other substances or have other risk factors. Some studies suggest associations with lower birth weight or developmental differences, though effects appear modest. Medical guidance typically recommends abstaining during pregnancy out of precaution, even as research continues. Against these risks stand therapeutic applications increasingly recognized in medical contexts. Cannabis and cannabinoids show efficacy for chronic pain, particularly neuropathic pain, unresponsive to conventional treatments. Multiple sclerosis patients report reduced spasticity. Epilepsy patients, particularly children with treatment-resistant forms, have shown dramatic improvement with cannabidiol treatment. Cancer and HIV patients use cannabis to manage nausea, pain, and appetite loss. The medical potential has driven research resurgence after decades of prohibition-imposed restrictions. Clinical trials are investigating cannabis for PTSD, anxiety disorders, Parkinson's disease, Crohn's disease, glaucoma, and more. Results are preliminary but promising in some areas, disappointing in others. Cannabis is not a panacea, but neither is it devoid of legitimate medical value. Comparing cannabis to other psychoactive substances provides perspective. Unlike opioids, cannabis does not cause fatal overdoses or severe physical dependence. Unlike stimulants, it does not stress the cardiovascular system acutely or produce compulsive dosing patterns. Unlike alcohol, it does not damage the liver or produce withdrawal that can be medically dangerous. Unlike tobacco, it does not create dependence affecting the majority of users or cause clear carcinogenic effects at comparable exposure levels. This does not make cannabis harmless. Impaired driving, psychological dependence, respiratory effects, and acute psychological distress are real concerns. But the risk profile is generally lower than substances legally available, a fact fueling arguments for legalization and regulation rather than prohibition. Harm reduction approaches emphasize education and safety rather than abstinence. Guidelines suggest avoiding use during adolescence when the brain is most vulnerable. Using cannabis with lower tetrahydrocannabinol and higher cannabidiol content may reduce anxiety and impairment. Avoiding mixing with alcohol or other substances reduces risks. Not driving while intoxicated is essential. Vaporizing or consuming edibles rather than smoking reduces respiratory harm. For those who develop problematic use patterns, treatment exists. Behavioral therapies, including cognitive behavioral therapy and motivational enhancement, show efficacy. Support groups provide community. Unlike with opioids or alcohol, pharmacological treatments are limited, though research continues into medications that might ease withdrawal or reduce cravings. The long-term picture for most users is relatively benign. Occasional or moderate use in adults appears to carry minimal health risks. Daily or near-daily heavy use, particularly beginning in adolescence, carries more concerning risks. The spectrum is wide, the individual variation enormous, and the relationship between use patterns and outcomes far from deterministic. This complex risk-benefit profile brings the narrative to its final movement, connecting the molecule to the broader human story. Cannabis, when examined as more than a plant or molecule, becomes a lens through which to view human culture, politics, medicine, and the contested boundaries of consciousness and control. The story of cannabis is inseparable from stories of colonization, racism, capitalism, medicine, and liberation. The plant that humans cultivated for 10,000 years was criminalized within decades of the 20th century, based not on scientific evidence but on political expediency and racial prejudice. The campaign that transformed cannabis from agricultural staple to dangerous drug relied on propaganda that explicitly targeted Mexican immigrants and African Americans. The language itself shifted from hemp and cannabis to marijuana, to emphasize foreign associations and fuel xenophobic fears. This prohibition created the framework for mass incarceration. In the United States alone, tens of millions of arrests for cannabis possession occurred over decades of the drug war. These arrests disproportionately affected communities of color, despite similar usage rates across racial groups. The consequences extended beyond criminal records to include barriers to employment, housing, education, and family stability. Entire communities were destabilized by enforcement of laws targeting a plant. Globally, the impact has been similarly devastating. Prohibition drove cultivation into the black market, funding armed groups and cartels in producing regions. Military interventions, funded and often led by the United States, attempted to eradicate cultivation, causing environmental destruction and displacement of rural communities. The violence associated with drug trafficking, violence created by prohibition, not inherent to the plant, has killed hundreds of thousands. Meanwhile, cannabis remained widely used. Prohibition did not prevent consumption. It criminalized it, creating costs without benefits. The harms associated with cannabis use were amplified by prohibition: uncertain potency and purity, criminal exposure, lack of education, barriers to seeking help for problematic use. The movement toward legalization represents recognition of prohibition's failure, but legalization has not undone prohibition's harms. Those imprisoned for cannabis offenses often remain behind bars or burdened with criminal records, even in jurisdictions that have legalized. Expungement processes exist in some places but reach only a fraction of those affected. The commercialization following legalization raises new concerns. Cannabis corporations, seeking profit maximization, market products with increasing potency, appealing packaging, and aggressive advertising. This mirrors the tobacco and alcohol industries, with similar concerns about prioritizing profits over public health. Indigenous communities and communities of color, who bore the brunt of prohibition, often lack capital to enter legal markets, while wealthy investors profit from the very substance that was used to justify criminalizing marginalized populations. Medical legalization preceded and enabled recreational legalization but created its own tensions. Patients who used cannabis as medicine for decades, often at legal risk, watched recreational markets drive up prices and shift regulatory attention. The distinction between medical and recreational use is often arbitrary. Many use cannabis for both symptom relief and pleasure, categories that overlap more than policy acknowledges. The pharmaceutical industry's interest in cannabinoids illustrates another tension. Corporations seek to patent specific formulations, dosages, or delivery methods, attempting to own knowledge that indigenous peoples and underground cultivators developed over centuries. The plant itself cannot be patented, but processed products and treatment protocols can be, raising questions about who should profit from cannabis and whether medical benefits should be reserved for those who can afford pharmaceutical products. Research, stifled for decades by prohibition, now flourishes in some jurisdictions while remaining restricted in others. The gaps in knowledge are vast. Basic questions about dosing, long-term effects, therapeutic applications, and harm reduction strategies need answers that prohibition prevented researchers from seeking. Decades of potential medical and scientific progress were lost to political ideology. Culturally, Cannabis has moved from countercultural symbol to mainstream acceptance. The stigma is diminishing but has not disappeared. Employment discrimination persists. Parents fear acknowledging cannabis use because of child welfare concerns. Athletes face suspension for positive tests. The normalization is incomplete and uneven. Internationally, the situation remains fragmented. Some nations embrace legalization, others maintain harsh penalties, including death sentences. International treaties still classify cannabis as dangerous, even as member nations increasingly reject that classification. The global framework is in flux, moving slowly and unevenly toward reform. Ecological considerations re-emerge as legalization expands cultivation. Industrial-scale cannabis agriculture raises concerns about water use, energy consumption, pesticides, and monoculture impacts. The plant that once grew alongside other crops, integrated into diverse agricultural systems, now often grows in massive monocultures, optimized for production efficiency at potential environmental cost. Indigenous perspectives remain marginalized. For communities that have used cannabis ceremonially or medicinally for generations, the plant holds cultural and spiritual significance that commercialization threatens. The appropriation of indigenous knowledge without recognition or compensation is a form of ongoing colonization. The future trajectory remains uncertain. Will legalization spread globally or fragment into patchwork systems? Will corporate consolidation dominate markets, or will small cultivators maintain space? Will medical applications be fully explored or restricted by pharmaceutical gatekeeping? Will restorative justice address prohibition's harms, or will they be forgotten in the rush to commercialize? The endocannabinoid system's discovery revolutionized understanding of human biology. This system, regulating pain, mood, appetite, and more, opens therapeutic possibilities extending beyond cannabis itself. Understanding how this system works may lead to treatments for numerous conditions, with or without plant-derived cannabinoids. The plant itself continues growing. Indifferent to human debates, cannabis will fruit whether humans cultivate it or not, though its form has been so shaped by human selection that wild survival of drug varieties is questionable. The relationship is symbiotic. Humans spread and protect cannabis, and cannabis provides humans with fiber, food, medicine, and altered consciousness. Families and communities navigate cannabis's role differently. Some integrate it unproblematically into daily life. Others struggle with members whose use becomes problematic. The plant does not determine outcomes. Human choices, supported or constrained by cultural context, access to information, and individual biology, shape whether relationships with cannabis are positive, neutral, or harmful. The molecule, tetrahydrocannabinol, is simple compared to consciousness. It binds to receptors, triggers signaling cascades, alters neural activity. But the experience, the subjective, felt, lived experience emerges from interactions more complex than any molecule. The same dose of the same compound produces different experiences in different people, different settings, different moments. The chemistry is necessary but not sufficient to explain the phenomenon. This reminds us that substances exist in contexts. Cannabis is not inherently good or evil, beneficial or harmful, liberating or enslaving. It is a plant that produces compounds interacting with mammalian neurology in specific ways. What humans make of this interaction depends on intention, environment, regulation, culture, and individual biology. The story of cannabis is ultimately a story about human societies deciding what consciousness states are acceptable, who gets to control access to substances that alter consciousness, and how to balance individual autonomy with collective well-being. These questions have no simple answers. Different societies at different times have answered differently. The cannabis plant, growing and producing its resins regardless of human law or opinion. reminds us that nature offers tools and substances humans can use or misuse, benefit from or be harmed by, integrate wisely or manage poorly. The journey from ancient steppes to contemporary dispensaries, from sacrament to contraband to commodity, reflects human history's full complexity. Cannabis has been medicine and intoxicant, fiber and food, spiritual tool and recreational pleasure. It has justified mass incarceration and funded organized crime. It has relieved suffering and caused harm. It has been demonized and celebrated, prohibited and prescribed. The plant remains what it has always been, a living organism producing chemical compounds as evolutionary adaptations. Humans projected meanings onto it, fought over it, profited from it, and suffered because of laws controlling it. The molecule's journey is also humanity's journey, our relationships with nature, consciousness, freedom, and each other, reflected in the story of a plant and the sticky resin coating its flowers.